Everybody, it's Peggy. I hope you're all having a good day. It is warm here in Washington State. I think we went from winter straight to summer. So I hope some of you will be able to join me live today, and if not, you're welcome to relax and listen to it later. What I'm going to read today is going to be chapter 5, and it's a pretty good chapter. It's about her first encounter with an obstacle or an enemy on her journey to the high places. And much afraid, our character in this allegory is trying to get used to the companion that the shepherd chose to take the journey with her and help her. But their names were Sorrow and Suffering. So this was hard for Much Afraid. She didn't want to even hold their hands, but I think she felt that the Lord will choose the right situations, the right companion for us out of love, and they will be a help to her, I think. So let's start. Encounter pride. From the very beginning, the way up the mountains proved to be steeper than anything Much Afraid had supposed herself capable of tackling. And it was not very long before she was forced to seek the help of her companions. Each time she shrinkingly took hold of the hand of either Sorrow or Suffering, a pang went through her. But once their hands were grasped, she found they had amazing strength. And they seemed able to pull and even lift her upwards and over places which she could have considered impossible to reach before. Indeed, without their aid, she would have been impossible. They would have been impossible, even for a strong and sure-footed person. It was not very long, too, before she began to realize how much she needed their help in another way. For it was not only the steepness of the climb and her own lameness and weakness which made the journey difficult. To her surprise and distress, she found there were enemies to meet on the way who would certainly have succeeded in making her turn back had she been alone. To explain this, we must now go back to the Valley of Humiliation and see what was happening there. Great was the wrath and consternation of the whole fearing clan when it was discovered that Much Afraid had made her escape from the valley and had actually gone off to the mountains in the company of the shepherd they so much hated. So as long as she had just been ugly, crippled, and miserable, little Much Afraid, her relatives had cared nothing about her. But now they found it quite intolerable that of them all, she alone should be singled out in this way and be taken to live in the high places. Perhaps she would be given service of the great king himself, they thought. So, are you afraid of sorrow and suffering like Much Afraid is? I know I certainly have been in my life. But I think trusting the Lord, and in this case, the chief shepherd, that he knows the best situation for her, the best companions, it's going to make it bearable, and she's going to be able to overcome it. How about this? If in the past, have you ever been without help and comfort during sorrow and suffering? And how did you make it through that? I think she just had to decide she needed to hold their hands. She needed to accept them. So what good, if any, comes from sorrow and suffering? I think through them we learn to trust in spite of appearances. And we learn to cling to the shepherd, and we become humble. We're humbled a lot of times by our circumstances, but that's a place where we can call out to him for help. So let's see where we left off. So, who was much afraid that this should happen to her, they thought, with the rest of the family drudged away in the valley of humiliation. It was not that they wanted to go to the mountains themselves, far be it, but it was intolerable that much afraid should do so. So it happened that instead of being a little nobody in the eyes of her relatives, much afraid had suddenly become the central figure in their interest and thought. Wow. So why do you think they wanted to prevent her from going up to the high places? I think they were jealous. Not only was her own immediate circle of fearing relatives concerned about the matter, but all of her most distant connections as well. Indeed, the whole population of the valley, apart from the king's own servants, were angered by her departure and determined that by some means she must be brought back, and the hated shepherd be robbed of his success in filching her from them. See, they hated him. They were so jealous. A great consultation went on between all the more influential relatives, and ways and means discussed by which she could be captured most effectively and be brought back to the valley as a permanent slave. Finally, it was agreed that someone must be sent after her as quickly as possible in order to force her to return. Could not conceal from themselves that force might prove impossible, as apparently she had put herself under the protection of the great shepherd. Some means then would have to be found to beguile her into leaving him of her own free will. That's the thing, we have free will. How could this be accomplished, they thought? In the end, it was unanimously decided to send a distant connection of the family named Pride. The choice fell on him for several reasons. He was not only very strong and powerful, but was also a handsome young man, and when he chose, could be extremely attractive. It was emphasized that if other means proved unsuccessful, he was to feel no scruples against exerting all his powers of fascination in order to coax Much Afraid away from the shepherd. Wow. Besides, it was a well-known fact that the young man was by nature far too proud to admit defeat or lack of success in any undertaking, and that there would be no giving up on his part until he accomplished his purpose. As everybody knew, to confess in defeat and return without Much Afraid would be the last thing possible to Pride. So when he consented to undertake the task, it was felt that the matter was as good as settled. So why was Pride suggested? He was strong. Pride is strong, powerful, and it can be attractive, convincing, and persistent. Much Afraid and her two companions, therefore, had only been a few days upon the journey, and made but slow, though steady progress. One morning, on turning a corner of the rocky pathway, Pride was seen striding toward them. She was surprised and discomfited at his unexpected apparition, but not unduly alarmed. This cousin had always so disdained and ignored her very existence that at first it never occurred to her that he would even speak to her, but expected to see him pass by in the same haughty manner as usual. Pride himself, who had been skulking and spying for several hours before he showed himself, was on his part delighted to find that though Much Afraid seemed to be traveling in the care of two strong companions, yet the shepherd himself apparently was not with her. He approached her, therefore, quite confidently, but with a most unusual affability of manner, and to Much Afraid's great surprise, stopped when they met and greeted her. "Well, Cousin Much Afraid, here you are at last. I have had such ado to catch up with you." How do you do, Cousin Pride?" said that poor little simpleton Much Afraid. Of course, she ought to have known better than to greet, much less to stop and talk with one of her own relatives from the valley. But it's rather pleasant being snubbed and ignored for years, suddenly to be greeted as an equal. So you see, Pride was working on her even. She had a self-image, always ignored and snubbed. And then here comes this, the best guy in the family, trying to beguile her. So besides this, her curiosity was awakened. Of course, had it been that awful and detestable craven fear, nothing would have induced her to stop and speak with him. "Much Afraid," said Pride seriously, actually taking her hand in a kindly and friendly manner. It so happened that at that place the path was not quite so steep, and she had freed her hands from those of both Sorrow and Suffering. He says, "I have made this journey on purpose to try to help you. I do beg you to allow me to do so, and to listen very attentively and seriously. My dear cousin, you must give up this extraordinary journey and come back with me to the valley. You don't realize the true position in which you have put yourself, nor the dreadful future before you. The one who has persuaded you to start this improper journey," Pride could not bring himself even to mention the shepherd by name, "is well known to have seduced other helpless victims in the same way. He's lying to her. Do you know what will happen to you, Much Afraid, if you insist in going forward? All those fair promises he has made about bringing you into his kingdom and you live happily ever afterward would prove false. When he gets you up to the wild, desolate parts of the mountains, he will abandon you altogether, and you will be put to lasting shame." So here's abandonment coming into the picture now, fear of abandonment, and shame. She has always felt shame about herself, her looks, her lack of abilities. So he's appealing to these things in her. Poor Much Afraid tried to pull her hand away, for now she began to understand the meaning of his presence here and his bitter hatred of the shepherd. But as she struggled to free her hand, he only grasped it tighter. She had to learn that once Pride is listened to, struggle as one may, it is the hardest thing in the world to throw him off. She hated the things that he said, but with her hand grasped in his, they had the power to sound horribly plausible and true. Did she not often find herself in her heart of hearts thrust the same idea and possibility which Pride was suggesting to her? You see, she had that old way of thinking. Even if the shepherd did not abandon her, and that she couldn't believe, might it not be that he who did allow Sorrow and Suffering to be her companions would also allow her, for her soul's good, of course, to be put to shame before all her relatives and connections? Was she not almost certainly exposing herself to ridicule? Again, Pride. How are pride and self-pity different? Pride is about caring about what others think about you, and self-pity is feeling sorry for yourself. Was she not almost certainly exposing herself to ridicule? Who could know what the shepherd might allow her to go through for her ultimate good, perhaps, but quite unbearable to contemplate? It's a terrible thing to let pride take one by the hand. Much Afraid suddenly discovered this. His suggestions were so frightfully strong, and through the contact of touch, he would press them home with almost irresistible force. Come back, Much Afraid, he urged vehemently. Give it up before it's too late. In your heart of hearts, you know that what I'm saying is true, and that you will be put to shame before everybody. Give it up while there's still time. It is merely a fictitious promise of living places. And is that worth the cost you are asked to pay for it? What is it that you seek there in that mythological kingdom above? He said. Entirely against her will, and simply because he seemed to have her at his mercy. Much Afraid let the words be dragged out of her. I'm seeking the kingdom of love, she said faintly. I thought as much, sneered Pride. Seeking your heart's desire, huh? And now, Much Afraid, have a little pride. Ask yourself honestly, are you not so ugly and deformed that nobody, even in the valley, really loves you? That's the brutal truth. Then how much less will you be welcome in the kingdom of love, where they say nothing but unblemished beauty and perfection is admitted? Can you really expect to find what you're seeking? No, I tell you again that you feel this yourself and you know it. Then be honest at least and give it up. Turn back with me before it's too late. Oh, pride. So, what did Pride tell Much Afraid was the reason she couldn't live in the kingdom of love? It's because she was too blemished and deformed and not perfect enough. So that would be, he would want her to do something to become good or perfect, right? Excuse me. So yes, that's a works mentality. In other words, we are saved by grace. It's not by our works. And so he's trying to appeal to her what she could do. So, poor Much Afraid. The urge to turn back seemed almost irresistible. But at that moment, when she stood held in the clutch of Pride, feeling as though every word he spoke was the hideous truth, she had an inner vision of the face of the shepherd. She remembered the look with which he had promised her, I pledge myself to bring you there, and that you shall not be put to shame. Then it was as though she heard him again, repeating softly, as though looking at some radiant vision in the distance. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Thou hast dove's eyes. Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee. See, that's how he really sees us. That is the real person that we are. He sees us as perfect. We are perfect in him, but also the things we go through on earth, though they may not be from him initially, he'll turn them for good and he will perfect us. He'll make us beautiful through the things we go through. So before Pride could realize what was happening, Much Afraid uttered a desperate cry for help and was calling up the mountain, "Come to me, shepherd, come quickly. Make no tarrying, Lord." There was a sound of loose, rattling stones and of a prodigious leap. And the next moment, the shepherd was on the path beside them, his face terrible to look at, his shepherd's staff raised high above his head. Only one blow fell, and then Pride dropped the hand he had been grasping so tightly and made off down the path and round the corner, slipping and stumbling on the stones as he went, and was out of sight in a moment. Wow. So how did Much Afraid banish Pride? She turned to the shepherd. She called him like he told her to. And bam, he was there. So the shepherd said, Much Afraid, in a tone of gentle but firm rebuke, "Why did you let Pride come up to you and take your hand? If you had been holding the hands of your two helpers, this could never have happened." For the first time, Much Afraid, of her own free will, held out both hands to her two companions, and they grasped her strongly. But never before had their hold upon her been so full of pain, so bitter with sorrow. She learned in this way the first important lesson on her journey upward, that if one stops to parley with Pride and listens to his poisonous suggestions, and above all, if he is allowed to lay his grasp upon any part of one, sorrow becomes unspeakably more unbearable afterwards, and anguish of heart has bitterness added to it. Moreover, for a while, she limped more painfully than ever since leaving the valley. Pride had trodden on her feet at the moment she called for help and left them more lame and sore than ever. Wow. That's so interesting, that sorrow becomes unspeakably more unbearable after you let Pride in, and sorrow become an anguish of heart has bitterness added to it. So even if you're suffering, if you have the sweetness in your heart, then bitterness is not there, and it will be more tolerable to bear. I know that for a fact. That is the end of chapter 5, where she's met with Pride, and she tripped on it. She tripped on him, She didn't overcome that obstacle without the help of the shepherd, and now the two companions are going to help her the rest of the way. But even through all these things she's going to learn, they are lessons for life for her, and they're also changing her. She's being changed little by little from Much Afraid to a new name, which I won't tell you right now what it is. Well, next week is chapter 6, and I hope that you'll be able to join me live at one point here, and we can talk back and forth. And if not, just listen later. And I love you all, and I'll just say goodbye for now, and I'll see you next week at 3 p.m. on Saturday. Okay, bye-bye.